On the morning of February 1st, 2026, something was wrong at Nancy Guthrie's home before anyone even knew she was gone. Her blood was on the front porch. More blood trailed down the driveway. Her doorbell camera had been manually disabled at 1:47 in the morning, and the medication her doctor said she could not survive 48 hours without was sitting exactly where she had left it, on her kitchen counter. The moment investigators walked through that door, time started moving against them. 13 days later, a deputy from the Pima County Sheriff's Department walked a pool cleaning crew into the backyard of that property. The company, Ambience Pool Service and Supplies, had no prior service record at that address. The FBI had not finished processing the scene. In the days and weeks after that, pizza was delivered to the house. A landscaper showed up with equipment. Journalists walked to the front door and took photographs of blood that was still visible on the ground. That was not a one-time mistake. It was the beginning of a pattern. Welcome back to Cold Case History. I am going to walk you through every detail of this case: the footage, the forensics, the suspect behavior, the DNA, and the digital evidence trail. If you are new here, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. We cover every update on cases like this one the moment they break. And trust me, this one is not finished breaking yet. Let's begin at the beginning. Over the 30 days that followed Nancy's disappearance, a series of decisions emerged that drew criticism from retired FBI agents, former homicide detectives, a former justice of the Arizona Supreme Court, and members of the sheriff's own department. Decisions about how the DNA was handled, how far the search perimeter extended, what was shared with the media before it should have been, and who was kept away from the investigation when they could have helped most. Every claim in this video comes from official statements, named professionals, court records, and the sheriff's own words on camera. By the time we are done, you will understand why the most significant barrier to finding Nancy Guthrie may not be the person who took her. It starts with the crime scene, and it starts on day one. Nancy was reported missing around noon after she failed to appear at a friend's home for a church live stream. Deputies responded. Then the sheriff arrived, and he acknowledged on camera that this is not something he typically does. He said there was something that was not right. He called homicide detectives out, not as a precaution, but deliberately. He said he rarely does that for a missing persons case. That alone told you what they believed they were looking at. Blood at the entrance of the home, a camera disabled in the middle of the night, life-saving medication still on the counter, and a clock that started the second those deputies crossed the threshold. Here is something most people have never had to think about. There is a principle in forensic science that has been foundational to criminal investigation for more than a century. It is called Locard's exchange principle, and it states something deceptively simple. Every contact leaves a trace. Every person who enters a space deposits something: skin cells, hair, shoe fibers, soil, biological material, and takes something away. It is not a theory. It is a physical reality that cannot be argued with. What that means for a crime scene is this: every unauthorized person who enters after a crime has occurred lays their own biological signature on top of the suspect's. Their DNA mingles with the suspect's DNA. Their shoe impressions overlay the suspect's impressions. Their fibers fall on surfaces where the suspect's fibers already settled. And in a courtroom, a defense attorney does not need to prove their client was innocent. They only need to show that the physical evidence is so contaminated it cannot be trusted. That is exactly why crime scenes are sealed. That is why access logs exist. That is why there is always one person at the perimeter whose sole job is to document every single individual who crosses it. Name, time in, time out. No exceptions for anyone. That is not what happened at Nancy Guthrie's home. The property was not immediately secured in a way that prevented public access. Journalists approached the front of the house and photographed visible blood droplets. Blood the sheriff later confirmed belonged to Nancy. Sergeant Aaron Cross, the president of the Pima County Deputies Organization, the labor union that represents the sheriff's own workforce, told the New York Post that the scene looked unprofessional. He said it did not reflect well on the department. The initial forensic processing took what the sheriff described as nearly 20 hours. Then the home was released. Former NYPD detective and John Jay College professor Michael Alcazar appeared on CNN and said that investigators had probably moved too fast in releasing the crime scene. But releasing the scene was only the beginning of the problem. Forensic death investigator Joe Scott Morgan, the host of Body Bags, who has built his entire career working alongside medical examiners on complex death cases, tracked what happened to that property after it was handed back. Journalists toured the grounds. Content creators followed. A pool maintenance crew was escorted in by a uniformed deputy. A landscaper entered the rear yard. Food was delivered. A home health worker visited. Morgan said there was no gatekeeper. Nobody stationed at the perimeter. Nobody controlling who came and went. In any correctly managed major crime scene, the protocol is clear. You do not just secure the building, you secure the entire surrounding property. You establish a command post. You station someone at the perimeter line whose only function is to log every person who crosses it. That process is what allows a chain of custody to survive cross-examination. That process did not exist here. Morgan said investigators now face a problem that no laboratory can untangle. They cannot prove where the DNA they collected actually originated. Every individual who walked that scene deposited biological material that mixed with whatever the suspect left behind. He said the DNA they are counting on to break this case could belong to the pool cleaner. And separately, while all of that was unfolding on the ground, the FBI discovered a roof-mounted camera that no one had located during the first sweep of the property. In a case where doorbell footage had already become the single most important piece of evidence, the image broadcast to the entire country, a second camera was sitting on the roof untouched. The FBI had to bring in Google engineers afterward to attempt to recover data from the device. The sheriff later acknowledged to the Associated Press that he probably should have waited longer before releasing the home. Now to the DNA, because this is where the contradictions multiply. The biological evidence collected at Nancy's property was sent to a private forensic laboratory in Florida. It was not sent to the FBI Laboratory Division at Quantico, Virginia. That distinction matters enormously. Quantico operates one of the most comprehensive forensic facilities in the world. It maintains dedicated rapid processing pipelines specifically designed for kidnapping cases. Because in an abduction, time is not just a factor. It is the only factor that determines whether a victim comes home alive. The sheriff told NBC News that a mixed DNA sample recovered from inside the home could take weeks, months, or as long as a year to process at the Florida lab. His words, weeks, months, or up to a year. The best outcome in that window has already expired. The worst outcome places results in February of 2027, a full year after Nancy was taken. In that span, surveillance footage from businesses along potential escape routes gets written over. Witnesses lose details. People relocate. Cell tower records age beyond retrieval. The entire body of circumstantial evidence surrounding the crime deteriorates with every passing month. Quantico's rapid processing capability exists specifically because investigators have understood that reality for decades. There is another dimension to this that cannot be overlooked. A glove was recovered approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home. The FBI has stated that it exists. The sheriff has stated, on Fox News, that it does not. We will get back to that contradiction in a moment. But first, what the glove represents forensically. The DNA profile recovered from it was run through CODIS, the FBI's national database containing the genetic profiles of more than 19 million convicted offenders. The search returned no match, meaning the person who wore that glove has no prior conviction requiring a DNA sample submission. But that does not make the profile worthless. It means investigators need to move to investigative genetic genealogy, the same methodology that identified the Golden State Killer after 4 decades and connected Brian Kohberger to the murders in Idaho. DNA expert Cece Moore, chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, told the Today Show that if she were the person who took Nancy, she would be deeply worried right now. But genetic genealogy requires a usable, isolated DNA profile. Every week the Florida lab spends working through mixed, potentially degraded samples is a week that profile is not being constructed, not being uploaded to GeneMatch, not being compared against the millions of people who have voluntarily submitted their genetic information to ancestry databases. The clock is not only running on the investigation, it is running on the science. When asked why the evidence went to Florida instead of Quantico, the sheriff said the Florida lab had been handling the department's evidence from the start and that he did not want to divide samples between 2 facilities. But the deeper problem with the DNA evidence runs beneath that explanation entirely. On February 14th, an FBI official told NewsNation that the sheriff was preventing federal agents from accessing key evidence, including the glove discovered inside Nancy's home. That same day, the sheriff went on Fox News and said there was no glove. He said investigators never found a glove in that house, never removed one, never had one. The FBI told one outlet it existed. The sheriff told another outlet it did not. Both statements cannot be true. In a case where the public is being asked to trust the information coming from the people running the investigation, that is not a minor inconsistency. It is a structural fracture. Former Arizona Supreme Court Justice Andrew Gould responded to the evidence handling on Fox News. He said he believed the sheriff had made mistakes in this investigation that impeded it. That word was chosen carefully. Not complicated. Not slowed. Impeded. It came from a former justice of the state's highest court. If you're still here, subscribe, because cases like this only work when people stay. And tell us where you're watching from. I love seeing my global family represent. Drop your country or city in the comments. Now let me show you how the contradictions began stacking on top of one another, because the glove and the DNA were only the beginning. On February 16th, the sheriff stood before cameras and cleared the entire Guthrie family. All siblings, all spouses. He said not one member of the family was a suspect, that anyone who suggested otherwise was not just wrong but cruel, and that he was telling people to stop, effective immediately. But 11 days earlier, at a press conference broadcast by Fox News, the sheriff was asked directly about speculation regarding family members. His answer was that everybody remained a suspect. He said that was simply how investigators think. He used the word everybody. And throughout the investigation, detectives returned multiple times to the home of Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cyan. They removed mail with gloved hands and placed it into evidence bags. They conducted searches at a property where the crime did not occur. You cannot publicly absolve a family while your own detectives keep visiting a family member's address with evidence collection equipment. Either the family is cleared, or it is not. Either those searches have evidentiary value, or they are consuming resources that belong elsewhere. Both versions cannot be true simultaneously. That tension connects to a broader structural question that people inside the investigation have voiced publicly. Sergeant Cross stated that the FBI should have assumed control of the case within the first several days. He said the FBI is the world's premier agency for kidnapping investigations, that they have superior resources and personnel, and that the sheriff's department should have taken a supporting role. For the FBI to formally lead, they need authorization, either through a determination that a federal crime occurred or through an explicit invitation from local law enforcement or the family. The family did not make that request publicly. And the sheriff, the man with an 11-year history with the FBI that you are about to hear about, was not extending one. He told News Nation that the suggestion he would tell the FBI no on anything was absurd. But there is a meaningful difference between not saying no and actually handing over control. You can cooperate without relinquishing authority. And cooperation without authority is precisely what sources described. The FBI providing personnel, technology, and analytical resources while the sheriff's department retained decision-making power over the evidence, the labs, the communications, and the boundaries of the search. On February 23rd, the contradictions became a national story. ABC, CBS, NBC, and CNN all reported through independent law enforcement sources that the masked suspect had appeared at Nancy's door on multiple occasions prior to the night she was taken. The evidence was in photographs already in the FBI's possession. One image showed the suspect carrying a backpack and a holstered weapon. Another showed what appeared to be the same figure without either. For separate networks, for sets of independent sources, all reporting the same thing. The Pima County Sheriff's Department issued a written statement characterizing those reports as purely speculative, claiming there was no timestamp associated with the images. For major news organizations, do not simultaneously publish the same fabricated claim from invented law enforcement sources. That is not how this industry operates. What does happen is that investigators share information with reporters on background, and then leadership releases a public statement that contradicts what their own people said privately. The result is a public that cannot determine what is true because the people running the investigation cannot agree on basic facts. Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent James Gagliano laid out the structural failure on Fox News. He said the sheriff was conducting separate interviews with different outlets, and each one produced a slightly different version of events. He said things had been walked back, stated incorrectly, and then revised. He said this was not the appropriate way to manage communications in an investigation this significant. Instead of structured press briefings where every journalist received identical information at the same moment, the sheriff sat separately with Fox News, NBC, the Daily Mail, the BBC, News Nation, and others. Each conversation produced a slightly different portrait of where the investigation stood. The public was left trying to reconcile competing accounts from the same source. And now the pacemaker, because this may be the single most consequential failure of the first 30 days. Nancy has a pacemaker that transmits data wirelessly via Bluetooth to her Apple devices. At 2:28 in the morning on February 1st, the pacemaker's signal disconnected, meaning Nancy was either moved out of Bluetooth range or the device was somehow interrupted. In mid-February, reporting emerged that investigators had placed an FBI Bluetooth detection system aboard a helicopter, technology capable of identifying the wireless signal from Nancy's pacemaker while airborne. The mechanics of this are not complicated. The helicopter flies a methodical grid over the surrounding terrain, the desert washes, the residential zones, the rural stretches beyond the city limits. If the pacemaker is transmitting even a minimal signal, the detection equipment can triangulate its position. No warrant is required for airspace. No ground teams move. No one is alerted. Silent, invisible, and precise enough to identify a specific building or location. If Nancy was alive and being held within the search radius, this was the most powerful tool available, and it would only work if the person holding her did not know it existed. That technology was reported in the press before the helicopter had completed its search pattern, before every grid square had been covered, before the tool had been given its full opportunity to work. Think through what that disclosure meant for anyone who had taken her. If you are holding a person and you learn from a news broadcast that law enforcement has airborne equipment capable of detecting your captive's pacemaker signal, you have a limited window to respond. A Faraday cage assembled from aluminum foil and cardboard blocks Bluetooth. Relocation outside the search radius eliminates the risk entirely. Or you can take a more permanent action that eliminates the signal for good. Whatever response the person responsible may have made, it was enabled by the fact that someone told the press about that technology before it had finished its work. A tool that depends entirely on secrecy to function was compromised the moment it became a headline. Gagliano addressed this directly. He said there are times when releasing information gives the suspect more than it gives the public. The origin of the leak has not been determined. Fox News first reported the technology on a Saturday. An FBI official subsequently confirmed sophisticated tools were in use to News Nation. Whoever disclosed it, the window closed before blame could be assigned. Now the search perimeter, because the physical search had its own critical failure. Investigators established a 2-mile canvas radius from Nancy's home and began collecting surveillance footage from properties within that zone. A couple named Elias and Danielle Strategoulis live approximately 2.5 miles from the Guthrie residence on a residential road called Camino Real. It is a back road, the kind that avoids every major intersection between the Guthrie neighborhood and the main arterial routes out of the area. The kind of route a person leaving a crime scene at 2:30 in the morning would choose without thinking twice. Their street-facing Ring camera captured 12 vehicles passing between midnight and 6 in the morning on February 1st. One of those vehicles appeared at 2:36 in the morning. Nancy's pacemaker disconnected at 2:28. NBC correspondent Liz Kreutz drove the route from Nancy's home to the Strategoulis camera location. The trip took 6 minutes. The math: 2:28 disconnect, 6 minutes of driving, 2:34 arrival, vehicle appears at 2:36. 2 minutes of margin. The margin you would expect if a driver paused at the end of Nancy's street, checked their mirrors, confirmed the road was clear, then pulled onto Camino Real and drove away from the scene. Retired NYPD Detective Pat Brown reviewed the footage with her team and assessed the vehicle as a Kia Soul. Compact, common, quiet. The kind of car that does not attract attention from a neighbor glancing out a window at 2:30 in the morning. The critical point is not what the footage shows. It is that the Strategoulis home sits half a mile outside the canvas perimeter. No one from law enforcement knocked on their door. No one requested their footage. They came forward themselves after following news coverage, checked their camera, and brought the material to investigators voluntarily. The question that raises is not complicated. How many other cameras between 2 and 5 miles from Nancy's home recorded relevant footage that was never requested because the perimeter stopped too soon? Experts analyzing historical abduction data have estimated that Nancy's remains, if she did not survive, are most likely within 2 to 5 miles of her home. If the canvas covered 2 miles, it may have stopped precisely at the edge of the zone where the most significant evidence exists. The sheriff confirmed on February 27th, 26 days into the investigation, that detectives were now reviewing vehicles and footage in areas farther from the crime scene. During this same period, the Madres Buscadores de Sonora arrived in Arizona. For those unfamiliar, the Madres are a volunteer search organization out of Mexico with a documented record of more than 5,000 recoveries of missing persons, most of them in Sonoran desert terrain that is effectively identical to the landscape surrounding Tucson. They know the desert. They know the washes and the arroyos and the places where ground conceals what has been buried. They traveled specifically to assist in the search for Nancy. The sheriff's department turned them away. The statement from the department said volunteer groups were asked to give investigators space and that this work is best left to professionals. 5,000 recoveries. Zero cost. Desert expertise that no local agency can replicate. Turned away. And while the Madres were being redirected, the department's 911 communications infrastructure was being overwhelmed. Between February 1st and February 19th, the department received over 32,000 calls. Nearly 24,000 were administrative, compared to under 9,000 during the same window the prior year. Tips, speculation, misinformation, and genuine emergency calls were all flowing into the same lines. No dedicated tip infrastructure was established in the critical early period. The FBI tip line ultimately processed more than 40,000 contacts, but the first weeks were already gone. And despite public statements about coordination with Mexican authorities, relevant because Tucson sits close to the border and the possibility of cross-border transport existed, Mexican officials told reporters that no formal FBI request had been received. The American side said coordination was active. The Mexican side said no one had made contact. One more contradiction in a case built on them. Now I need to show you a piece of history that connects everything you have just heard, because the pattern you are looking at did not begin on February 1st, 2026. It began 11 years earlier. In 2015, the FBI opened an investigation into the Pima County Sheriff's Department over the misuse of civil asset forfeiture funds. Civil asset forfeiture allows law enforcement to seize money and property connected to criminal activity, funds that are legally required to be spent on approved law enforcement purposes. What investigators found was different. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in seized assets had been diverted. Awards banquet expenses. $20,000 spent constructing a commercial kitchen inside the department so a cafe could operate there. A cafe reportedly run by the niece of a senior departmental official. Chief Deputy Chris Radke was indicted on federal charges. He was directly beneath the sheriff in the chain of command. The indictment made national news. In 2016, while the federal probe was still active, Radke died by suicide. The sheriff at the time was Chris Nanos. He was not charged. He was not indicted. But the investigation occurred under his command, and what it did to his relationship with the FBI has been documented by people who were in that building. In an interview with local Tucson station KGUN during the investigation, Nanos called the FBI's work garbage. He said he was absolutely furious. He challenged the Bureau to step forward when it was over and acknowledged the entire thing was baseless. He did not keep those feelings private. He went on camera. Former Chief Deputy Richard Kajiger later told the Daily Mail that Nanos harbors deep disdain for the FBI and that the grudge from 2015 has never gone away. Now hold that history next to everything in this video. The DNA routed to a private Florida lab rather than the FBI facility at Quantico. An FBI official telling NewsNation the sheriff was blocking access to evidence. The sheriff denying it on Fox News the same day. Separate interviews producing competing versions of the same facts. A search perimeter that did not expand for 26 days. The Madres Buscadoras turned away. Pacemaker detection technology disclosed before it had finished its work. The crime scene released before the FBI completed its examination. I am not telling you those two timelines are connected. I am placing them side by side and letting you look at them. The first timeline ends with a federal indictment, a death, and a sheriff going on television to call the FBI's investigation garbage. The second timeline is a kidnapping investigation where that same sheriff made a series of decisions that, according to his own deputies, his own former colleagues, a former Arizona Supreme Court justice, and multiple retired FBI agents, impeded the search for a missing woman. You can conclude those timelines are unrelated. But the people inside the department have already reached their own conclusion. Before Nancy Guthrie ever disappeared, 85 out of 86 Pima County deputies voted no confidence in Chris Nanos. Sergeant Cross, the union president, called this an ego case. A source inside the department told reporters the sheriff had converted a serious investigation into a rolling spectacle. Former Chief Deputy Richard Carmona said that while detectives and deputies were working tirelessly and focused entirely on finding Nancy, the failure was at the senior leadership level. Retired FBI Special Agent Robin Drake offered an assessment that may explain how all of it fits together. He said Nanos may be functioning as what he described as an unintentional noise black hole, drawing media attention and generating controversy in a way that keeps the press focused on the sheriff rather than on the evidence. Whether that dynamic is intentional or simply the product of institutional collapse, the result is identical. The sheriff has become the story. And as long as the story is about the sheriff, about his contradictions, his interviews, his decisions, it is not about the DNA, the footage, the suspect, or Nancy. Drake also raised the possibility that the 98% no confidence vote had created a situation where investigators were not fully briefing their own commander. If the detectives working the case understood that information shared upward might appear in an individual interview the following morning, timed badly, phrased incorrectly, or directly contradicted by a statement the sheriff gave a different outlet an hour later, they would protect the investigation by limiting what they reported upward. The sheriff then speaks publicly from incomplete information. The statements emerge wrong, or outdated, or inconsistent. The press reports the contradictions. The investigation drowns in noise while the actual work moves forward around the sheriff rather than through him. The people doing that work deserve to be separated from this entirely. The detectives reviewing thousands of hours of surveillance footage, frame by frame. The FBI analysts running genetic genealogy on partial profiles. The lab technicians working to isolate mixed samples. The officers knocking on doors across the Catalina foothills. Those people are doing their jobs under conditions that their own leadership made harder. CNN chief law enforcement analyst John Miller said, "This is nowhere near a cold case." He is right. The forensic infrastructure to solve this exists. It is active. It does not require the sheriff's press conferences to function. The question this case is asking is not whether it will ultimately be resolved. It is whether the decisions made at the top added days, weeks, or months to the timeline. And in a case where the sheriff himself stated on camera that Nancy could not survive 24 hours without her medication, where experts now assess she likely did not survive the first 72 hours after she was taken, added time is not theoretical. It is the difference between finding a woman alive and finding what was left of her. Between justice delivered and a conviction made harder by evidence that decayed while the investigation stumbled over itself. On day 3 of this investigation, the sheriff told reporters that he was not used to people hanging on his every word and then holding him accountable for what he said. He was right. He was not used to it. He had placed a political opponent on administrative leave weeks before an election he won by 481 votes. He had placed the union president on leave for holding a sign that said deputies did not want nanos. 85 out of 86 of his own deputies had already told him they did not believe in his leadership. None of that produced accountability at this scale. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance changed that. The entire country is watching now. And what they are watching is a man who sent DNA to a private lab instead of the FBI, who denied the existence of a glove the FBI says was recovered, who publicly cleared a family while his own detectives continued searching their property, who told reporters on February 5th that everyone was still a suspect, and then told reporters on February 16th that anyone who suspected the family was cruel, who issued a written denial contradicting 4 independent news networks, who allowed pacemaker detection technology to become a headline before the helicopter had finished its grid, who drew a search perimeter that stopped short of the camera that may have captured the suspect's vehicle, who turned away an organization with 5,000 documented desert recoveries, who told the press that coordination with Mexico was active while Mexican officials said no one had contacted them. Someone took Nancy Guthrie. The evidence that will identify that person is sitting in laboratories, stored on servers, captured on cameras that have not yet been reviewed. It is not going anywhere. It is waiting. The only question is how much time the person responsible has had to prepare for it. If this case matters to you, hit subscribe and turn on your notifications right now because the next video on this case is going to a place that nobody watching today is expecting, and you are going to need the context you just built by finishing this one. Share this video with someone who has been following the case. Leave a comment telling me what you believe the biggest single failure in this investigation has been: the crime scene, the DNA lab, the pacemaker disclosure, or something else entirely. And if you think the 2015 FBI investigation is relevant to the decisions made in 2026, say so in the comments. Because the conversation happening in this community is part of how cases like this one stay alive. The moment we stop paying attention is the moment the people responsible get comfortable. Stay uncomfortable. I will see you in the next one.